Hello, my name is Andrew Jones. I'm chairman of the International Wine and Food Society. I would like to introduce you to Jane Anson, who has been invited to deliver this year's André Simon lecture. It should have been delivered to a live audience on the last day of the Paris and Bordeaux Wine Festival. Inevitably, the festival had to be postponed as a result of the coronavirus, and it will now take place at the same time next year, beginning in Paris on Thursday, 15th of April. Instead of postponing the André Simon lecture, we decided to record it on video so that the entire membership will have the opportunity to see Jane and listen to her lecture on the Society's website. Jane Anson is a wine educator and journalist. She lives in Bordeaux. She teaches at the École de Vin. She's the Bordeaux correspondent and columnist for Decanter magazine, and she's written numerous books. In 2013, she wrote Bordeaux Legends, which is about the 5 first growths of the 1855 classification. A book about Chateau Angelou was published in 2016. The following year, she published a book entitled Wine Revolution. This is about the best organic, biodynamic, and natural wines in the world. Jane's lecture draws on a theme discussed in her most recent book, which is entitled Inside Bordeaux, the Chateau, their wines and the terroir. It was published a few months ago and has been extremely well received by the critics. One described it as the most complete, up-to-date and scientifically informed book on Bordeaux currently on the market. Having read the chapters about Bordeaux terroir and looked at her commentary on at least some of the individual estates, I have to say that that's a conclusion which I really do endorse. In her lecture, Jane poses the question, is there such a thing as terroir in Bordeaux? Terroir is a subject that's not often discussed in relation to Bordeaux. It's a region that's dominated by great estates and iconic names such as Latour, Lafite and Rothschild. But Jane believes that terroir is fundamental to understanding how Bordeaux is adapting and innovating in the face of changing climate. She explains why the words Bordeaux and terroir have so rarely been seen together in the past. She demonstrates how terroir explains why certain estates have been accorded such great respect over several centuries. And she explains how a greater understanding of terroir can help us as ordinary consumers to make better purchasing decisions. I have, of course, already listened to this recording. I found it fascinating, very informative indeed. I'm sorry that festival goers did not have the opportunity to meet Jane in Bordeaux, but I suppose there's been at least one positive result of the pandemic. It did prompt us to do this recording and present the lecture to the entire membership, who will now have the opportunity to see Jane and listen to her on the website.
Okay.
Finally, on behalf of the Society, I would like to thank Jane for a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And I do hope that you will enjoy it as much as I did. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to the annual André Simon lecture in 2020.
Now, I was thinking that speaking about Bordeaux in an André Simon lecture is particularly moving, as he gave the world some of the best descriptions of Bordeaux ever written, and he added to all of our sums of knowledge about this region. André was French, he was from Paris, not from Bordeaux, and he spent most of his life living and working in the UK wine trade. But he loved Bordeaux. On what would have been his 100th birthday in 1977, a lucky group of 400 people gathered in the Savoy Hotel in London to drink the Latour 1945, which had come out of André's cellar and which he had left specifically for that reason. I was looking back at the lectures that have been given on the André Simon lecture over the past few decades, and in fact there are surprisingly few that have been specifically talking about Bordeaux itself, except for the very first one, which was given by Michael Broadbent, and it ended with a toast to André Simon with a glass of Yquem. As I was also preparing this lecture, I began to wonder if André would have approved of it, the title being about terroir, the subject about terroir. Would he have felt that that didn't add to the idea of poetry and wine, which, as all of us who have read him know, that his belief was that it was the emotion of wine, the sharing of wine, that was really the heart of the matter. Certainly the topic of terroir in Bordeaux is fairly modern in that it has only really been taken seriously in the past few decades. But it is also ancient in that it relates to the forces that shaped this region and the wines that we drink today over many millennia. It's also, I believe, one of the key questions that we can ask today. Does Bordeaux have any claim to terroir, and why? The Bordelais themselves line up reasons for you pretty much to reject it. If we look at the flagship wine ranking in Bordeaux, which dates back to 1855, the world's first really culinary ranking of wines, which set Bordeaux wines from first growth, second growth, third growth, fourth growth, and fifth growth. The way they selected that was not on how the wines tasted, but it was on how much were they worth in the marketplace. So straight away, we are not linking it specifically to terroir, we're linking it to the value and how it was perceived. It's also the case that they gave the classification to the brands of the estate, to the name, rather than to the piece of land on which they stood. That has allowed, over the past 170 plus years, a little bit of creative accounting in terms of the land holdings for the estates. So I have a couple of figures for you. Mouton Rothschild was 53 hectares in 1855. It's 83 hectares today. Lafitte was 74 hectares in 1855 and 110 hectares today. Pichon Comtesse, 30 hectares in 1855, 74 hectares today. Pichon Baron, 20 then, 73 today. How can we say, when an estate has changed its size and shape so much, that it has a true claim to terroir? If we head over to the other side of the river, and we're over in Saint-Emilion, we do have, in many ways, a greater claim to a link between the wine and the estate. They also have their own classification over there that dates back to 1955. And there you have specific named pieces of land that are ranked. So that leads to situations such as La Gaffelière, which has 22 hectares of its 38 classified. Angelus has 27 out of 39. Villerine, 7 out of 11. Le Roc, just 27 out of a full 61. So here you can say, okay, they're doing their best to recognise terroir, but then you look at what else was needed to be classified, and it goes right back to, just as with 1855, it goes back to the brand, the cost, how much you pay in the marketplace for these wines, even things like how are their reception facilities, how many people can they bring in for wine tourism. So diluting, once again, the message that terroir is the key thing that matters. So sometimes you feel like the Bordelais are their own worst enemies for this. Let's look at even more reasons why there's no way that we can lay claim to terroir here. The wines tend to be split into first, second, third, sometimes even fourth wines. So a single estate that might cover 100 hectares will have its main estate wine, and then will split off different parts of its vineyard into other wines. Sometimes that is chosen every year, depending on the blend, depending on the taste at the time of blending. This is again a reason to perhaps distrust terroir. One of the regular occurrences in Bordeaux is that you have an owner who doesn't live on site. Many of these big, wonderful classified estates have owners who live in Paris or Geneva or New York, and have a director who lives on the estate and makes the wine. And even he may have delegated the vineyard to a viticulturalist, because these are often big estates. This necessarily dilutes the kind of feeling that the owners may have for the land on which their wine comes from. If the owner is only coming in to set the annual price of the wine, then it's hard to believe that he truly even cares about how much that reflects the piece of land. What he wants is for it to reflect the prestige of the property. Appellations don't always help if we look there. Appellations such as Bordeaux, Bordeaux Superior cover 53% of the production in Bordeaux, and yet they can be made anywhere in the region. So you could be making an AOC Bordeaux from 145 metres above sea level in Sainte-Foy-la-Grande, or at 0 metres above sea level, right on the banks of the Dordogne River, on Palu land, which is land that is right alongside the river. Both of those things would be completely within their rights to be called AOC Bordeaux, and yet are they really going to taste the same? Are we as consumers really going to know what we're getting? I think the answer is probably no. The sales system, even that is not helping us when we're looking for why we can say that terroir has a place in Bordeaux. The vast majority, about 75% of Bordeaux, is sold through a three-tier system, which is chateau owner, and then a broker, and then a merchant, a négociant. This once again dilutes that immediate link between owner and consumer, the person who is drinking. So even when producers are caring about their terroir and are doing their best to reflect it, that is not always getting communicated to the people who are drinking. And that is one of the reasons I think that we've overlooked and neglected the fact that there is so much happening in terroir in Bordeaux. And there have been a lot of a diminution of number of people making wine here over the last really 15 years. So if we look in 2006, there were almost 10,000 wine producers here. If we look in 2016, that had dropped to 6,500. Now what happened to those 3,000 or so estates? Some of them were sold up, grubbed up, and no longer making wine at all, but the vast majority of them were bought by bigger properties and brought in within those properties. So if you look at the wonderful appellations like Pauillac and Saint Julien, today there are very few small independent producers, and the bigger guys have kind of eaten up those little guys and included them in their chateaux because they're allowed to. It goes back to the 1855 ranking system, when if you give the ranking to the estate, they're completely within the rules to buy up a little small neighbours and include them. So this amalgamation, making estates bigger, again, has really diluted the idea of terroir, or the image of the idea of terroir. And just when we think we've covered all of the negatives, there's just one last one that I should mention, and that is that Bordeaux is a blended wine. One of the reasons why it's so much easier and much more instinctive to say that Burgundy is a terroir-driven wine is because there you have Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And so you can always see how those individual grapes are being translated through the land on which they're grown. Here in Bordeaux, wines are blended, and you'll tend to have estates that are 60, 80, 100 hectares in size, and they grow 3, 4, even 5 or 6 different grape varieties, and those are blended together at the end. Now that is an art, and it's the great strength of Bordeaux, but it makes it difficult for us as outsiders, as drinkers, to truly believe that we're getting a translation of the soil. There are anomalies as well of certain chateaux who choose the grapes because of personal preference, not entirely because of grape variety. Certainly historically, not entirely because of soil. Certainly historically this has been the case. There are some wonderful estates, Parma, Pichon Comtesse, Siron, brilliant estates that make fabulous wine, but you will find in most of them, certainly if you look back a couple of decades, that they are majority Merlot, and that is because they had the owners, the Mial family, and one of the family members was a big fan of Merlot and chose to put Merlot in a lot of his vineyards. These kind of stories that we know about Bordeaux dilute the image of the Bordelais as truly caring about terroir. On the bright side, this simplifies things hugely. It's one of the reasons why people can say that you start on Bordeaux and you progress to Burgundy, because there is a feeling that everything here is very simple. Just like Paris, Bordeaux has a left bank and a right bank. And just like Paris, it's easy to say that the left bank of Bordeaux gives us the intellectual wines, the Jean-Paul Sartre style of wines. And just like Paris, the right bank gives us the hedonistic, the Moulin Rouge style of wines. And in many ways, this is true. There are definitely stylistic differences between the two banks, but that also helps to reinforce this idea of Bordeaux as driven by men in suits, of driven by brands, and of being a world away from the authenticity and the terroir-driven approach of Burgundy, which, in my opinion, is not fair. So given all that I have just said, why do I argue that Bordeaux terroir deserves your attention and respect? Well, let's start by looking at just a simple definition of what terroir is. This was written by a professor here in Bordeaux called Kees van Leeuwen, and he said something I think that is important. Terroir is a cultivated ecosystem in which the vine interacts with the soil and the climate. Now we know what terroir is, we've heard the definition of terroir, but I think the point that we often mistake and we overlook is cultivated ecosystem. It means that there is a role for the hand of man in terroir, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that fact, and we shouldn't overlook it. So what are we dealing with? Why is Bordeaux such a complicated region to get a handle on, and why therefore do we find it so much easier to split it down into simple, to reduce it down to simple rules? Well, this is the biggest fine wine region in the world, as we know. It is 213 kilometres from north to south. It's 105 kilometres from east to west. There are around 114,000 hectares of vines. That's the 2016 figure. And if you get in your car and you drive around the outer limits of Bordeaux, you are covering more than 600 kilometres, and it's going to take you through 11 of the region's 65 appellations. So this is not an easy region to get to know, to really truly understand. The lowest spots of Bordeaux, as I said earlier, are at 0 metres above sea level. There are certain places where you can plant vines right by the river's edge, and in fact, some of the region's oldest vines are on those spots by the river's edge that have survived phylloxera because they were flooded at times during the phylloxera crisis, and they have survived today. So some of our greatest genetic treasures are there at these low spots. And the highest spot goes up to somewhere between 140 and 150 metres. Some of the highest spots of Bordeaux are not planted, so probably the highest vines are at about 145 metres. We have 65 appellations here, hundreds of different types of terroir, and as I said before, over 6,500 winemakers. So you've got a lot to get your head around and to deal with. So what are the basics? What do we say? What do we know? How do we approach Bordeaux normally? We typically split it into simple binary propositions. Left bank versus right bank. The Garonne River versus the Dordogne River. Gravel terroir versus clay terroir. Cabernet Sauvignon grape versus Merlot grape. Good vintages versus bad vintages. If the Bordelais have anything to do with it, good vintages versus challenging vintages. What's the reality? The reality is that it's one of the reasons I believe that we don't talk about terroir in Bordeaux is because it's just so complicated. There's so much of it. There's so much to get your head around and to really, really try and translate into what it means in the glass. If we just simply look at this left bank versus right bank split. Even that is not actually true or as simple when you look into it. You have two rivers in Bordeaux, the Garonne River, which is really kind of the backbone, and then you have the Dordogne River, and there's some land in between it. So rather than it being a simple 1-2 split, what it really is more like three slices of a pie. You have the left bank, you have the right bank, and then you have Entre-deux-Mers, which sits between the two, and in fact is a vast tract of land where an awful lot of AOC Bordeaux Superior land sits, but also also Sainte-Foy-la-Grande, Cadillac, Entre-deux-Mers, the wine region. You have a lot of appellations in that area as well, which often gets forgotten about entirely in this simple left bank, right bank split. You have soils that are coming from different parts of France and Spain because of these two rivers. So you have soils coming in from Spain that come down the Garonne River and the Pyrenees Mountains, and then you have soils coming in from the Massif Central in the middle of France from the Dordogne. The left bank, it's certainly true, is largely influenced by deposits brought over the millennia from the Garonne, and the right bank is largely influenced by deposits coming from the Dordogne River, so from the Massif Central. But Entre-deux-Mers, as you would expect, has a mix of both. So you get anomalies like the Côte de Cadillac, which has some of the greatest gravel terroirs, because you're getting a lot of deposits coming in from the Garonne. You also have anomalies where the left bank is almost entirely influenced by the Garonne River until you get to Margaux and above. Just below Margaux is where the two rivers meet, where the Garonne and the Dordogne meet. So all of a sudden you have a ton of different deposits coming from both parts that meet at Margaux. It's one of the reasons why Margaux is one of the most complex of all the soils of the Medoc, because it has this influence of the two rivers, and we tend to overlook that. We say that Cabernet Sauvignon is a left bank grape and Merlot is a right bank grape. But when you start to look, you realise that Merlot was planted all over Bordeaux. In fact, 66% of red plantings are the Merlot grape. So again, we realise that things are much more complicated than we talk about. Cabernet Sauvignon we think of as being Pauillac, Saint-Julien, Margaux. But today, more and more, we start to find Cabernet Sauvignon over on the right bank. Ozone has Cabernet Sauvignon. Many of the great estates over in Pomerol and Saint-Emilion have Cabernet Sauvignon, and that's increasingly becoming true because of global warming. So we can no longer use the same easy dichotomies, easy splits as we used to do. I hope and think that it's time that we look again. The vintages. We're used to saying this is a good vintage, this is a bad vintage, or we say this is a left bank vintage or this is a right bank vintage. The fact is that today, more and more, we need to be looking at vintages in terms of how they suit specific areas, how they suit specific terroirs, how they suit specific wine makers, because things are becoming more challenging. The reality of climate change is that there are different things to cope with. And all of these things now need to play into our understanding of what Bordeaux is today. There are unusual spots, unusual parts of Bordeaux which we have overlooked and we no longer should. So limestone, which we think of as being the dominant force of Saint-Emilion, and indeed it is, but there is some wonderful spots of limestone over on the left bank. There is a little village called Pujol-sur-Séronne, which has great limestone. Barsac, which is next to Sauternes and makes great sweet wines, also lots of fantastic limestone. And it's why you get incredible white wine, dry white wines like Clos Floridène, which is located in Pujol-sur-Séronne. It's a perfect spot for dry whites. But it also could be, as Barsac could be, a great spot for red wines, because we know how well reds do on the limestones of Saint-Emilion. Is it possible that red wines could be great in Barsac? That's areas that could be explored in the future. And when you start to look underground, you realise that even the Medoc has quite a lot of limestone, particularly as you go further north. So once you hit AOC Medoc, then you have a lot of limestone areas where, again, there are some great white wines being made, and again, potentially these wonderful mineral-driven reds, which for years have been overlooked because they weren't able to get ripe enough. But today, with what's happening with the climate, these are very exciting areas to explore. We think of clay, sticky clay, as being only a Pomerol thing, but actually when you start to look underground, you find other spots of beautiful high quality clay in areas like La Londe de Pomerol. So taking this approach of being more open to what there is in Bordeaux gives you all kinds of opportunities to explore and to find new things. Bordeaux has had heroes of terroir for centuries, but those heroes have multiplied over the past 20 years. If we start right back at the beginning, we head to the 17th century and the Dutch engineers. I've chosen here Jan Leegwater to highlight, almost certainly not his real name, because that means drawing out water, so it probably was a nickname given to him for his job. But he represents all of those Dutch agricultural engineers who came here, asked by the French government to drain the Medoc, and that it was that obviously that made the Medoc so clearly suitable for vine growing. So there is one of our first terroir heroes. And then we have guys like Hector de Bran, who was at Mouton Rothschild, Mouton at the time, who saw this link between Cabernet Sauvignon and these gravel soils, and was really one of the first people to fetishize this link between Cabernet and gravel, which continues to this day. So he also is a terroir hero. More recently, we have owners such as Lucien Lawton. Lucien Lawton in Margaux in the 70s and 80s became obsessed with the terroirs of Margaux. His sons tell me that they used to come across him digging holes all over the appellation because he was trying to find the best spots, many of which he then bought up. But he really wanted to publicise and talk about just how good the soils were of these appellations. More recently, we can date from to the 1950s the interest of of professors here in Bordeaux. There was a guy called Gérard Séguin. He wrote his thesis about the soils of Bordeaux. It was really the first time that somebody gave serious intellectual look at what there is in Bordeaux, what the soils are here. More recently, that has proliferated, and we have amazing professors, amazing researchers, Kees van Leeuwen, David Pernay, Xavier Chaunet, David Becheler. These guys have mapped a lot of Bordeaux. They have mapped what's happening here. They've worked with individual chateaux, individual appellations who have also carried out their studies, and there is a proliferation of understanding what is going on that simply wasn't true 20 years ago. Now, how do we think about terroir today? What does it mean to think about Bordeaux terroir? You've got to still take into account all of the things I said before about the negatives, about why it is hard to be clear and simple about what is happening in this region. So my suggestion is that we take a tip from Hollywood. We look at the dolly zoom. The dolly zoom was a technique which was originally given by Alfred Hitchcock in Vertigo. So I think it dates from 1958, and it was called at the time the Vertigo zoom. But for people of my generation, the dolly zoom will always and forever be associated with the film Jaws. And you have the guy sitting in his deck chair, and suddenly the camera lens shoots past him as he focuses in on the shark attacking the children on the lilo. I'm sure you all remember that scene. That is how I like to think of what's happening in Bordeaux today. It's all about focusing in on specifics. It's zooming in. It's not taking a broad blanket estate approach. So what tips can we take from Spielberg? The smart owners are realizing that this idea of zooming is how to get the best out of their soils, and therefore how to get the best out of their wines. So what does it mean? It means you zoom in on not just the climate of the whole vineyard, but the climate as it changes as your vineyard rises and falls. It means looking at the soils, but also the slope. What direction are they facing? How much sunlight are they getting? What happens in the cooler parts of the vineyard? How do you change the way that you're dealing with vines according to that? And this is important not just across your whole vineyard, but across every tiny plot within it. You have to take that knowledge and you have to apply it to the row orientation, to the planting density, to the choice of grape varieties, of rootstocks, of drainage, of canopy management. There are so many different things that you can use informed by your understanding of terroir. Importantly, you need to choose winemaking techniques that don't mask all the hard work you've done. If we look again, even 20 years ago, a lot of Bordeaux was about pushing for the greatest ripeness you could get to. It was about hang time. It was about having 100% new oak, even 200% new oak, which is when all of these things make a wine which is big and impressive, but that is really masking what's happening in the vine, in the vineyard itself. So you've got to be smart. You've got to make choices that don't do that. And you've got to keep on thinking, how do I translate the work I'm doing in the vineyard into the taste and the final glass? This is happening more and more. But in fact, it isn't new. When you look back at these vineyards that were recognised in 1855, and when you look at the vineyards that were recognised in 1955 over in Saint-Emilion, or in the 1950s, 1959 in Pessac-Léognan, the other classified area of Bordeaux, you look at these estates and you realise, you know, it wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't simply because they had wealthy owners who were able to invest. I'm not saying that didn't help, but that wasn't the only reason that these estates were recognised. When you start to look through the approach of terroir, it suddenly becomes clear that the guys who recognised these estates knew what they were talking about, and they were recognising something very important. And that is, the closer you look, the more you zoom, you see that the greatness of Bordeaux is a recognition of 4 specific quality soil types. They are, the first one is clay, but not just clay. There is clay and there is clay, but there are deep clays in Bordeaux called planisols, which are a specific, quality to the wines. There is a subset of those deep clays, which are sticky clays, and they are in tiny, tiny, tiny parts of Bordeaux, Petrus being the most obvious example, where it really does have an extremely different type of soil, type of clay to most of the estates that surround it. But if you look hard enough, you find 1 or 2 other tiny spots in Bordeaux where you find the same type of clay. The other quality type of soil in Bordeaux is called peyrosols. It's a gravel soil. And this is where, of the 61 1855 classified estates, 61 of them are on this type of peyrosol gravel. They're deep gravels. Then you have 2 different types of limestone. The 2 different types of limestone, one is very hard limestone, it's called Asteries limestone, and one is a slightly softer with a little bit more clay in it that is called Molasse de Francade. But those 4 soil types are key to quality wine production in Bordeaux. Now, when you start to kind of dig into these soil types, what you realise is they are directly linked to the wines that have been recognised. So, as I say, of the 61 1855 classifieds, you'll find them on that soil type 2, which is peyrosols gravel. But you will also find them for 2 of the 18 Premier Grand Cru Classés of Saint-Emilion. No prizes for guessing which ones, Figeac and Cheval Blanc. And you will find that a ton of the very prestigious Pomerols, like Trotanois, are also on this soil type. They may have this very heavy clay underneath, but they have gravels on top. Saint-Emilion is a brilliant example to show how it isn't just one soil type that makes great wine, because they also have a lot of their best wines, so 12 of their Premier Grand Cru Classés, are on this Asteries limestone, this hard limestone. And then this other kind, the Fronsadé, which is a slightly softer limestone, that you will find for 9 of the Premier Grand Cru Classés. The same soil types keep coming up. And then we have this very deep clay, which is on certain world-class Pomerols. But when you start to look, you also find that there is this sticky clay which underpins the vineyard at Le Tour. It isn't a coincidence that those locations have created world-beating wines, and we have done them a disservice for saying for centuries that it is because their owners were aristocrats who could afford to talk about them. When you start to look at maps of the region, you see that those soil types are not everywhere. They are not evenly distributed, and they are not globally found in Bordeaux, but they are found in other parts of the region, not just the famous ones. So it's always worth treasure hunting, looking out and finding where you can get value without the big names attached. Okay, so with full apologies to geologists, I'm just going to attempt to simplify another aspect of the left bank. And that is, we talk about the gravels of the left bank, but when you start to again look to zoom in, you see that they form a series of gravel ridges, of terraces that span all the way from Sauternes up to just above Saint-Estèphe. Now, I'm not going to look at the whole area today. I'm going to focus in on the Medoc. And one of the reasons that the left bank has these terraces in a way that the right bank usually doesn't. Some areas do, such as Pomerol, as I mentioned, because Pomerol is right by the river bed, so it has these deposits. But one of the reasons why the left bank has it much more than the right is because about 1 million years ago, you had a geological fault which thrust the right bank up and kept the left bank low. And that explains an awful lot about why we have such differences in between the two banks. Largely, the right bank is a much older and more static terroir. The left bank, because it's lower, because it has these deposits coming in from the rivers, is a younger terroir. So, there are 6. They very happily divided these into 6 different terraces. We're calling them from T1 to T6. And if you remember, I just said that the great estates of 1855 are on gravel terraces. Well, it gets even more interesting when you start to, again, drill down, zoom in a little more, and you see that the vast, vast majority of these 61 estates are on one of 2 terraces, Terrace 3 or Terrace 4. Terrace 1 is the oldest and the highest. That in itself tells you can't always apply the rules of the rest of the world to Bordeaux, because generally speaking, we think higher the better when it comes to quality viticulture. In Bordeaux, that is not the case. T1 and T3 can be as low as 20 metres above sea level. T3 a tiny bit higher, 26 metres above sea level. You're going to be looking at 2 maps behind me here, one of which shows you Pauillac terraces, and I've just put little circles around Le Tour, Mouton and Lafitte. And you see that Le Tour is on Terrace 4, Mouton and Lafitte are on Terrace 3. Now this pattern gets repeated all the way through Bordeaux. You keep hearing those 2 terraces coming up over and over again. Margaux, remember I said it's the most complex of all of the different appellations in the Medoc because it is at the confluence of the Dordogne and the Garonne. What happens when you look at the terraces, you see that it's the only appellation in the Medoc that has all 6, T1 to T6. So all of these things that we know in the glass, we know that Margaux has a ton of different expressions, but it can make sense, it can be underpinned by this knowledge when you start to look, and it can start to help you make buying decisions. It's really a fascinating way to start looking at the region. I'm going to leave that there, head over to the right bank, and show you here a map that spreads from right over in Fronsac all the way over to Castillon and Côte de France. We classically think of the limestone plateau as belonging to Saint-Emilion. When you dig down, you see that that limestone is all over the right bank. You can find fantastic high quality limestone in far less prestigious appellations than Saint-Emilion. And you also, let's zoom in on Pomerol. You see that Pomerol and neighbouring Lalonde are completely different soils. You're not going to find any limestone in either of those two appellations. So where at the beginning I said appellations don't help you. No, Bordeaux Superior can be found from across the region. In fact, certain appellations do give you clues. They do tell you what the wine is going to taste like. And Pomerol and Lalonde are great examples of that. They have very different soils to the surrounding area. So that's why, remember, Pomerol has the clay and then this gravel on top. Gravel is a hot soil. And yet they're not planting Cabernet Sauvignon there, although they are more a little today, but largely they're planting Merlot. So you have Merlot, which is an early ripening grape, on top of the hot soils of gravel. What does that mean? All of a sudden you understand why Pomerol wines are so sexy, so appealing, why their tannins are so easy to approach, so plush and so velvety. It's because they have this unusual mix of Merlot plus hot soil. Most of the right bank and most of Bordeaux puts Merlot on the cooler soils because they save the hot stuff for Cabernet Sauvignon. Because Cabernet Sauvignon isn't easy. It takes time to ripen. It needs hot soils to fully get to its full expression. But Pomerol has the great advantage of having fresh clay underneath, which keeps the freshness, and then the heat of the gravel on top. So they can gamble. They can take a gamble with Merlot, and they make these beautiful, sexy, approachable wines. Saint-Emilion is very different. When you look at that, you see it isn't just limestone. Parts of Saint-Emilion are sand. Parts of Saint-Emilion are gravel. It's why you have such different expressions. All of the rules that we think apply, in fact, when you look deeper, don't have to apply. And you can use that information to your advantage. The very last zoom I'm going to talk about is temperature. This is an oceanic climate. We talk about Bordeaux as being an oceanic climate, about it raining a lot because we're by the sea. But when you actually start to look, there are very distinct temperature bands. A researcher here called Benjamin Bois, who is also a winemaker, also works in Burgundy, has divided Bordeaux into 5 different temperature zones. And the way he judges that is by when grapes ripen. And what he has found is that there are the same parts of Bordeaux are always warmer. And funnily enough, they tend to be at the parts of Bordeaux where the greatest wines are. So along the corridor of the Garonne River, along those gravel terraces where the greatest 1855 wines are, they always tend to be warmer than the rest of Bordeaux. Around Pomerol, always warmer than the rest of the surrounding area. Even the limestone plateau in Saint-Emilion, warmer than the surrounding area. This has been a huge advantage over centuries. And what he finds is that the same grape variety and the same soil type, there can be up to a month difference of ripening, depending on where you are in this temperature zone. So this is another zoom, another layer that you can add to your understanding of Bordeaux. Apart from patting the classified growths on the back for being in the perfect location, what can we actually do with this information? How can we, as drinkers, take this information and make great choices because of it? We all need to kind of look beyond our accepted truths about Bordeaux. When you start to take this T3, T4 approach of the terraces, you start to make some great fun discoveries. So there is an estate which has long been recognised for being a great wine, which is called Sociando Mallet. It is not in the classification system. It's not in any of the good appellations. It's in AOC Haut-Médoc. It's above Saint Estèphe. As you're starting to head towards where the AOC Médoc goes towards the Atlantic coast, and where traditionally we have dismissed the wines. Now look, Sociando Mallet is on Terrace 4. It's on this same fantastic soil type that you find Latour and some of the greatest classifieds. And right next door, Sociando Mallet has been recognised for a long time, but right next door is one of the new Cru Bourgeois Exceptionnels, which is called Chateau Charmaille, that is far less known than Sociando or the classifieds, and yet it again benefits from these soil types. So, get on your investigating hat, have a look, and you will find some great wines to enjoy. When you have very hot years like 2003, start looking at soil types and you can benefit from them. You look for where will be the freshest areas. Chateau Ozone in Saint-Emilion is one of the greatest wines from that extremely hot vintage because it is on limestone. And limestone, even though it is a warmer region, as we saw from the temperature map, it keeps freshness. You always get low pH, which means fresh acidities on limestone. And it's a brilliant place to look. We might not all be able to afford Ozone, but we can afford other estates on those limestone places in vintages like 2003. If you're a left bank lover, look to Saint Estèphe in 2003 because you have a lot of clay and limestone underneath the gravel. It's very different types of soil from Pauillac or from Margaux. So it's great we can use this knowledge and we can find great wines in hot vintages such as that. You want to look for estates who are isolating their terroirs, who are using this dolly zoom technique. There is an estate which is very little known called Chateau Chambrun and Moncet in Lalande de Pomerol, and they have tiny, tiny bits of soil that have this high quality sticky clay. And just for the last 4 or 5 years, they have been isolating it and putting it into a separate bottling called La Cure. Now that is a great estate, I would say, to get to know, because then we can start seeing the impact that this high quality clay has without having to pay the prices of Petrus. So there are all kinds of things happening that we can make the most of. And in these years, which is blanket success, years like 2009, 2010, where the biggest estates tend to rise in price, if we use this knowledge, we can find value. So if you love the limestone of Saint-Emilion, look at Fronsac, look at Castillon, look at these other areas that produce great wine on the same soil type for less money. This is really an empowering consumer decision. It is about finding out what's happening so that we can benefit from it. Well, I expect that we will increasingly be celebrating those estates at whatever level, classified or smaller properties, who take their terroir seriously and who practice this zooming technique. Chateau Monrose is a great example of that. In 2012, which is just 8 years ago, they divided the 95-hectare vineyard into 24 separate plots. Today, that same vineyard is split into 88 plots, and those 88 plots are set across 26 different microclimates. So what that means is they are really measuring what's happening in the vineyard in tiny increments per row and per small plot. And where in the old days, which means a decade ago, they would have done the harvest in one big swoop, starting, let's say, from the left-hand side all the way through to the right-hand side in one swoop from start to finish. Today, it's more like a zigzag, more like a dance, where they will go across to the parts of the vineyard that most need harvesting. I expect that we will also increasingly celebrate the cooler climate spots that maybe for decades have been dismissed for their difficult tannins, for their inability to fully ripen. I think we're going to start looking to them more and more. This means the areas like Castillon, like Fronsac, like the AOC Medoc, lots of places where we have missed out on what could be some fantastic wines, and which I think we will increasingly see in the future. Don't discount, of course, the big guys. They don't want to go anywhere, and I think we're going to see them adapting. So even if they are in the warmer spots, they're going to work out, and they already are doing, how to handle it, how to react to what their terroirs can give them, the challenges that they can give them. So what you're seeing today is Cabernet Sauvignon being planted at Ozone. You're seeing Petit Verdot being planted at Yon Figeac. You're seeing low temperature fermentation at Aubailly, where they're looking at 24 degrees for fermenting as opposed to 28 or 30 degrees, which you would have seen traditionally maybe 15, 20 years ago. These are small adaptations, subtle changes, but they absolutely make big differences, and they respect what's happening in the vineyard. Another really interesting case study to look at is Carmaux-Briand. Carmaux-Briand is located right next to Aubriand, very close to the city centre of Bordeaux. It's in one of the warmest spots of the whole region. And the challenge can be that when you get very ripe fruit, as you do in warm spots, you get high alcohols. Now they have thought laterally, and what they're doing now is they are using stems in their winemaking. Stems are something that you very rarely see in Bordeaux, because traditionally the stems are going to be green, harsh tannins, you want to get them out. But what Carmo-Brion are doing, which is very smart, is they're separating the stems from the grapes. They're finding the ones which are the ripest. Often that means they're red, they're giving beautiful flavours, but also they've got good acidity, and they're putting them back together with the grapes for the fermentation. And this year in 2019, 55% of the fermentation was done in this way. Again, this is smart thinking. These are top quality estates who are not being bowed by the fact that the climate is changing, and they are finding ways to make it work for them. I think basically what all of this means, it is admitting that a cultivated ecosystem is something to be celebrated, not something to be embarrassed of, this idea of the hand of man. We're used to thinking that terroir has to be there, eternal, when in fact what we need to see more and more in Bordeaux is it's how people adapt to where they are. It's how people recognise and treat what they're given. And maybe André Simon would also have seen that that is its own type of poetry, of making sure that what we're tasting in the glass that we drink is a true reflection of the site that it comes from, as worked and handled and